I don't own a single piece of clothing with my name on it. No patches, no pins, no NASA logo on a jacket. When I go to the memorial, I go as nobody. Baseball cap, old jeans, sunglasses that are slightly too big for my face. I've done this every year for 3 years, and not once has anyone recognized me. That's the point. My name is Luna Vasquez. I'm 28 years old, and I am, on paper, one of the most decorated astronauts of my generation. In real life, I am someone who cries in parking lots and tells her therapist she's processing well. I drove 4 hours from Houston to Washington, D.C. alone. I made a playlist for the drive and skipped every single song after 30 seconds because nothing felt right. I stopped at a gas station in Virginia and bought a coffee that tasted like regret and a granola bar I didn't eat. I do this every year. I have a whole ritual around doing this every year. And every year I tell myself it'll be the last time. And every year I find myself back in the same parking lot, staring at the same sky, putting on the same sunglasses that are too big for my face. The memorial is crowded on Memorial Day. I know, obvious statement. But there's something about the particular quality of that crowd that I never get used to. Families with strollers, veterans in uniform, teenagers who were dragged here and are on their phones, a man selling American flags near the entrance who says, "God bless you to everyone, including me, and I say thank you," back like I mean it. Because I do. Kind of. Everyone is carrying something invisible. That's the one thing we all have in common. I know exactly where I'm going. Section 7. East wall. Middle panel. I've memorized the coordinates the way I memorize flight trajectories. Because it matters. Because precision is how I cope. Because if I focus on the steps, I don't have to focus on what's waiting at the end of them. 32 steps from the main path. Left at the oak tree that leans slightly south. Then the wall appears, and my chest does the thing it always does, which is simultaneously collapse and expand in a way that has no medical explanation. There are 3 names I come for. Commander David Reyes, Mission Specialist Tariq Okafor, Pilot Jinsu Park. I say their names out loud every year, quietly, like a password. Like if I say them right, something unlocks. Nothing ever unlocks. But I keep saying them because stopping feels like a different kind of dying, and I've already watched enough of that. I sit on the bench across from the wall. It's a plain wooden bench, not particularly comfortable, which feels appropriate. Comfort would be wrong here. I take off my sunglasses because wearing them feels dishonest, and I look at their names until my vision blurs, and then I put my sunglasses back on and look at my hands. This is the routine. It takes approximately 40 minutes and leaves me feeling like I've been turned inside out and then put back together slightly wrong, which is, genuinely, the best I can do. She was already on the bench when I sat down. I didn't notice her at first. I was too focused on the wall. But after a few minutes, I became aware of her the way you become aware of weather. Gradually, then all at once. She was sitting at the far end, knees together, shoulders curved inward, holding something against her chest with both hands, crying quietly, not the performative kind, the kind that happens when someone thinks no one is watching. I am very good at pretending I don't notice things. It's a skill you develop when you work in close quarters with people for months at a time. You learn to give each other the dignity of private moments. So I looked back at the wall. I focused on David's name. I thought about the way he used to laugh at his own jokes before he finished telling them. I was doing fine. I was absolutely doing fine. Until I wasn't. She shifted on the bench, and the thing she was holding moved, and I saw it. A photograph. Printed. Not on a phone. Actually printed. The kind with white borders. And in the photograph was a figure in a white spacesuit, helmet under one arm, face turned slightly upward toward something beyond the frame. I knew that spacesuit. I knew that helmet. I knew the particular way that figure stood with her weight on her left foot, because her right knee had been bothering her since training. I knew her because she was me. 3 years ago, 40 minutes before I boarded a shuttle that would change everything. A stranger was sitting on a memorial bench crying, holding a photograph of me, and she had absolutely no idea I was sitting 3 feet away from her. If this story already has you feeling something, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were me, sitting 3 feet away from a stranger holding your photo? Because I promise, what I did next was not what anyone expected, including me. I have made some questionable decisions in my life. I once convinced my crew to celebrate Christmas in July during a simulation exercise because morale was low and I had a Santa hat in my locker. I signed up for a second mission 11 months after the first one nearly killed me. I bought a houseplant 3 years ago that I have kept alive through sheer stubbornness and what I can only describe as mutual respect. But sitting on that bench, turning to a crying stranger and asking about the photograph she was holding against her chest, that might be the most irrational thing I have ever done. And I have done things in zero gravity. I didn't plan it. I want to be clear about that. 1 second I was looking at my hands, running through my usual internal monologue about grief and closure, and all the other words my therapist uses that sound right in her office and hollow everywhere else. The next second I heard myself say, quietly, almost to the wall, "That's a beautiful photograph." The stranger looked up. I immediately wanted to be launched into space, which, to be fair, is usually an option for me. Her name was Cameron. I didn't know that yet. What I knew, in that first second of eye contact, was that she had the kind of face that made you feel like you'd interrupted something important. Not in a hostile way, but in the way of someone who had been very far away inside themselves and was now slowly returning. Her eyes were dark and a little swollen from crying. She looked at me like she was deciding whether I was safe. I tried to look like I was. She looked down at the photograph, then back at me. "I took it," she said. Her voice was steadier than I expected. 3 years ago, at the Kennedy Space Center. I was covering the launch. She paused. "I've never actually shown it to anyone." I nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you something that lands heavier than they intended. Because here is what I was thinking. Sitting on that bench, listening to this stranger describe a photograph of me that I had never seen, I was thinking that I didn't remember anyone taking that picture. I didn't remember her. I was there. In that moment, I was the person in that photograph. And I had no memory of her at all. I asked if I could see it. She hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, which felt significant. And then she held it out. I took it carefully, by the edges, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else. And I looked at myself 3 years younger, standing on the launch pad in the Texas heat, face turned up toward something the camera couldn't capture. I looked calm. I looked certain. I looked like someone who had no idea what was coming. Looking at that photograph felt like reading a letter from a version of myself I no longer knew how to contact. "She looks like she's ready," I said. I meant it as an observation. It came out as something else entirely. Cameron was quiet for a moment. "She does," she said. "That's why I kept it. Everyone else in my shots that day looked nervous or excited, or performing for the cameras. She just looked ready, like she'd already made peace with whatever was going to happen." I handed the photograph back. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me because nothing else was. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when 2 people have accidentally wandered into a conversation that's too real for small talk and too fragile for anything bigger. The crowd moved around us. Someone's child ran past laughing. A military band started playing something soft in the distance. I thought about David, about Tariq, about Jinsu. I thought about the photograph. I thought about the fact that this woman had been carrying an image of me for 3 years without knowing my name. She told me she came every year. I told her I did too. She looked at me sideways, curious, and I realized she was waiting for me to explain why. What name on the wall had brought me here? I said I'd lost people. She nodded. She said she had too, in a way. The astronaut in that photo, she said, looking down at the photograph again, didn't make it back the same. None of them did. I always felt like I owed them something. Like I captured something I didn't fully understand yet. I looked at the wall. I said, "Maybe you're still figuring it out." She introduced herself when we stood up to leave. Cameron Park, 27, freelance photographer, Houston-based, which made me stop walking for half a step because Houston is where I live and Houston is where I would be returning to in 4 hours, and the world is either very small or very deliberate, and I have never been able to decide which. I told her my name was Luna. Just Luna. She smiled, small, a little tired, genuinely warm, and said it was a good name for someone who kept showing up to places alone. She reached into her bag before we parted ways and pulled out the photograph. She held it out to me. "I think you should have this," she said. "I don't know why, but it feels like it belongs with you." I took it. I looked at it one more time. This stranger's portrait of a version of myself I barely recognized. Then I looked at Cameron, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, but didn't want to look away from. I put the photograph carefully in my jacket pocket, against my chest, exactly where she had been holding it. I didn't tell her why. I wasn't ready to explain that the woman in the photograph was me. I drove back to Houston with the photograph on the passenger seat. Not in my bag, not in the glove compartment. On the seat, face up, like a passenger. I know how that sounds. I'm a scientist. I calculate orbital mechanics for fun. I once spent 6 hours debugging a pressure valve issue in low Earth orbit while running on 4 hours of sleep and a protein bar, and I did it correctly on the first try. And yet I drove 4 hours down I-45 with a photograph of myself riding shotgun because putting it away felt wrong. I'm not going to defend that. I'm just going to report it accurately. I thought about Cameron the entire drive. Not in a dramatic way, more like the way a song gets stuck in your head, quiet and persistent and slightly inconvenient. The way she'd held the photograph, the way she'd said she didn't make it back the same, without knowing she was talking to me. The way she'd smiled when she said Luna was a good name for someone who kept showing up to places alone, like she'd noticed something real about me in 40 minutes that people I'd worked with for years had missed entirely. I told myself it was just the strangeness of the situation. I'm very good at telling myself things. I went back to training the next morning like nothing had happened, because that is what I do. The Johnson Space Center in Houston does not care about your emotional revelations on park benches in Washington, D.C. The Johnson Space Center cares about mission readiness, physical conditioning, and whether you can correctly execute an emergency EVA procedure under simulated pressure. I can. I always can. I do the thing and I feel the feelings later, usually at 2 a.m., usually while staring at the ceiling of my apartment, usually with cold coffee that I made and forgot about, and then remembered and decided not to reheat because the effort felt disproportionate to the reward. The NASA communications team told us on Wednesday that a photographer had been contracted for an institutional shoot, coverage of training sessions, facility documentation, material for the mission press package, standard procedure. I nodded along in the briefing like I was paying attention, which I was, mostly, except for the part where my brain was still occasionally replaying the particular quality of Cameron's silence on that bench, and how it had felt like being understood without having to explain anything. I filed that under irrelevant, and went back to my checklist. She was in the training bay on Thursday morning. I saw her before she saw me, which gave me approximately 3 seconds to decide how to handle the situation. My options were: act normal, pretend I didn't recognize her, or briefly consider whether the airlock was an option. I was wearing my flight suit. My name was on my chest in large, clear letters. There was absolutely no version of this where she didn't figure out who I was, and I knew it. And I stood there for 3 full seconds doing the mental equivalent of buffering before she turned around and we made eye contact. The look on her face moved through about 6 emotions in 4 seconds. I watched all of them. Recognition first. The slow, uncertain kind. The way you recognize a song from the first 3 notes but aren't quite sure yet. Then confusion. Then something sharper, more focused, as her eyes dropped to the name on my chest and came back up to my face. Then a long pause where neither of us said anything, and the low hum of the facility equipment was very loud. Then, and this is the part I was not prepared for, she laughed. Not a mean laugh. A quiet, disbelieving, almost helpless laugh, like someone who has just realized the universe has been making a joke at their expense for 3 days. Luna Vasquez, she said. Not a question. I said, Cameron Park. She looked at me for another moment, then at the room around us, then back at me. You were sitting 3 feet away from me, she said. You let me tell you about the photograph, I said. You handed it to me. She said, I told you she looked ready. I said, she thought she was. The laugh faded into something quieter. She looked at me with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, which is a combination I didn't know a face could hold until hers did it. We didn't talk much after that. She had work to do. I had a simulation in 20 minutes, and the training bay was full of people who did not need to witness whatever this was. But at lunch, she sat across from me in the cafeteria without asking, put her camera bag on the floor, looked at the menu board for a long time, and said, The chicken here looks aggressively average. I said, It is. I've been eating it for 3 years. You develop a relationship with it. She ordered the chicken. I took that as a good sign, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. She asked, while we were eating, why I hadn't told her at the memorial. I put down my fork and thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and because I could tell she was someone who would know the difference. Because you were telling me something true, I said. About the photograph. About why you kept it. And if I'd told you who I was, it would have changed everything you said. I didn't want it to change. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. That's either very thoughtful, she said, or very strange. I said, in my experience, those are usually the same thing. She texted me that evening. Not a long message, just a photograph attached, no caption. It was a picture she'd taken that morning in the training bay, before I'd noticed her. I was standing at a window, coffee in hand, looking out at the facility with the same expression I apparently always have when I think no one is watching. I didn't look like an astronaut in that photo. I didn't look like a survivor or a decorated officer or any of the other things my file says I am. I looked like someone in the middle of figuring something out. I looked, I thought, like a person. I saved the photo and typed back, "You do this to everyone, or just people who don't tell you their name?" 3 minutes later, she replied, still deciding. Here is something no one tells you about falling for someone when you have a launch date. It doesn't feel like falling. It feels like standing very still while the ground moves under you. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not making any dramatic choices. You're just eating aggressively average chicken in a NASA cafeteria and texting someone photographs back and forth. And one morning you wake up and realize you've been smiling at your phone before you're fully conscious, and that is, medically speaking, a situation. Cameron had a 3-week contract with the communications team that somehow kept getting extended. First because they liked her work, which, having seen it, I understood completely. She had a way of finding the human inside the institutional, the specific inside the general. Her photos of the training facility didn't look like press material. They looked like portraits of people who happened to be in a very unusual building. The communications director extended her contract a second time on a Tuesday. And I found out via Cameron texting me a photograph of the extension paperwork with the caption, "Looks like you're stuck with me." I read that message 4 times. I told myself I was checking for grammatical errors. We developed a routine, which is the most dangerous thing 2 people can do. Lunch in the cafeteria when our schedules aligned, which was more often than coincidence could reasonably explain, though I was not ready to examine that too closely. Coffee in the morning if she arrived before my first simulation. Evenings were sporadic. Sometimes she'd send a photograph with no context, and I'd send back a voice note with no context, and somehow it constituted a full conversation. She was easy to talk to in a way that felt almost suspicious. I kept waiting for the part where it got complicated, where I found the thing that made her difficult, because everyone has a thing. Her thing, as far as I could tell, was that she cared too much about everything and tried to make it look like she didn't. I recognized that particular strategy immediately because it is also my thing. She photographed me constantly. I am not someone who photographs well. I have a face that does what it wants regardless of what the camera is doing, and what it usually wants is to look like I'm solving a math problem. But Cameron's photographs of me looked nothing like that. She'd catch me mid-sentence in a briefing, or looking out the window of the simulator, or standing in the parking lot eating an apple because I'd forgotten to have lunch at a normal time again. In every single photograph, I looked like someone who was, despite significant evidence to the contrary, doing okay. I asked her once how she did that. She said, "I just wait until you forget I'm there." I said, "That's not possible. You're very hard to forget." There was a pause. Neither of us acknowledged what I'd just said. We moved on with great dignity and mutual pretense. The mission came up for the first time between us on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks in. We were sitting on the hood of my car in the Johnson Space Center parking lot after a long day, sharing a bag of chips that neither of us had really wanted, but both of us had needed, watching the Houston sky do the thing it does in May, where it can't decide between pink and gold and just commits to both. She said, without looking at me, "When do you leave?" I said, 6 weeks. She said, "Okay, just okay." No follow-up, no weight in her voice. No attempt to make it into something we needed to fix right then. I looked at her sideways. She was still watching the sky. I thought, this person is either very calm or very good at this. Then I thought, both of those things scare me equally. I started noticing small things the way you do when you know time is a factor. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused on a shot. The way she always ordered coffee and then let it go cold because she'd get distracted. The way she said my name. Not Lieutenant Vasquez, not Luna with any particular emphasis. Just Luna, easy and ordinary, like it was a word she'd always known. I noticed these things, and I cataloged them with the same precision I use for flight data, because precision is how I cope, and because some part of me knew I was building something I might have to leave behind in 6 weeks. She asked me on a Thursday why I'd signed up for another mission. We were in the cafeteria, late, after most people had cleared out. The question landed quietly, without accusation, the way Cameron asked most things, like she was genuinely curious and would accept whatever the answer was. I told her the official version first. The mission was important. My skill set was specific. The team needed me. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "And the real reason?" I looked at her across the table. She was holding her cold coffee in both hands, watching me with that careful and open expression that I had completely failed to develop any immunity to. I said, "Houston is very quiet." She nodded slowly. She didn't push. That was the moment I understood that she already knew, and was simply waiting for me to catch up. The days started going too fast, which is what days do when you want them to slow down. I'd be in a simulation and realize 40 minutes had passed in what felt like 10. I'd be talking to Cameron and look up, and it would be 2 hours later, and the cafeteria would be empty around us. Time behaves differently when something is ending. It compresses. gets dense, starts leaving fingerprints on everything. I noticed it, and I didn't mention it, and I filed it under things I would deal with later, which was becoming a very full folder. She showed me her portfolio one evening. The real one, not the professional website. A hard drive's worth of photographs she'd never published. Places she'd been and people she'd found and moments she'd caught that belonged to no assignment and no editor. There was a whole series from a hospital waiting room in the middle of the night. A series from a bus station in November. A series from a high school graduation in a town she'd driven through once. They were all photographs of people in transition, between one thing and another, not quite here and not quite there. "You always photograph people in between," I said. She looked at the screen for a moment. "I know how that feels," she said. "Being in between." I looked at her. She looked at me. Outside, Houston was doing its best impression of a normal evening. Inside, something shifted, quiet and irreversible, the way important things usually do. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for 11 minutes. The photograph from the memorial, my photograph, the one she'd given me, was still on my kitchen counter where I'd put it the day I got home. I'd looked at it every day. I'd looked at it that morning. I went inside, picked it up, and stood there holding it the way she'd been holding it on that bench. I finally understood what her face had looked like when she cried. It wasn't grief exactly. It was the particular ache of caring about something you can't protect. I put the photograph down carefully. I made cold coffee. I stared at the ceiling. I thought, 6 weeks is not very long, and I have spent 3 years being very good at leaving, and I am not sure those two things are going to be compatible this time. Dr. Patricia Reeves has known me for 7 years, which means she has approximately 7 years of evidence that I am not, despite my best efforts, as fine as I claim to be. She was my mission commander before she became head of astronaut readiness, and she made that transition with the same energy she brings to everything, direct, unhurried, and completely unbothered by the fact that most people find her terrifying. I do not find her terrifying. I find her exhausting in the specific way that people who are always right are exhausting. She called me into her office on a Monday morning, which is never a good sign, because Dr. Reeves schedules hard conversations on Mondays deliberately, the way a dentist schedules root canals at 8 a.m. Get it over with. Move on. No lingering. Her office smells like coffee and old mission reports. There are no personal photographs on her desk, which has always struck me as either very professional or very sad, and I've never been sure which. She was standing at the window when I came in, which meant she'd seen me crossing the courtyard, which meant she'd had time to prepare whatever she was about to say, which meant I was already at a disadvantage. I sat down without being asked. She turned around. She looked at me the way she looks at flight data when something doesn't add up. Not alarmed, just methodical. "How's training?" she said. I said, "Good." She said, "That's not what I asked. Dr. Reeves does not do small talk. What she does is ask a question that sounds like small talk, and then wait in silence until you answer the real question underneath it. It's a technique I've watched her use on 12 different astronauts over 7 years, and I have never once seen it fail, including right now, on me." I looked at the wall behind her. I said, "Training is on schedule. Simulations are running clean. I'm physically at peak readiness." She said, "And mentally." I said, "Also fine." She said, "Luna." Just my name. One word. The specific tone of someone who has heard every version of fine and can identify the counterfeit ones by sound. She sat down across from me and put a folder on the desk that she didn't open, which meant it was there for emphasis, not information. "I've watched you train for 3 weeks," she said. "You're technically excellent. You always are. But you're running on autopilot, and I've known you long enough to know the difference between you being focused and you being absent." I started to respond. She held up one hand. Not rudely, just firmly, I'm not done. I closed my mouth. She continued. I've also noticed that you've been eating lunch in the cafeteria every day, which you have never done voluntarily in 7 years. You usually eat at your desk or in the simulator bay, standing up, in under 8 minutes. She paused. The photographer. It wasn't a question. I considered briefly denying it. I rejected that option for 2 reasons. First, because Dr. Reeves would see through it immediately, and second, because I am 28 years old and a NASA astronaut, and I have some dignity left. Her name is Cameron, I said. Dr. Reeves nodded slowly, the way she nods when she's filing information rather than reacting to it. How long? She said. I said, 3 weeks. She said, and the mission? I said, 6 weeks. We looked at each other. The math was not complicated. Dr. Reeves has always been very good at math. She didn't tell me to end it. I want to be clear about that. Because Dr. Reeves is complicated in ways that her reputation doesn't capture. She leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something less clinical. You know what I've watched happen to good astronauts over 20 years, she said. Some of them go up empty and come back the same. And some of them go up with something unresolved and it follows them into space, and it sits in the back of their head during every critical moment. She looked at me. The second kind worries me more than the first. I said. Which kind am I? She said, I'm trying to figure out if you know. Here is the thing about Dr. Reeves that I have never said out loud to anyone. She was the one who told me about the accident. She was the one who sat across from me in a room that smelled like coffee and mission reports and said the names of my crew in past tense for the first time. She has never once brought that up as leverage or context or explanation for anything. She carries it the same way she carries everything, without display, without complaint, without asking anyone to notice. I notice anyway. I've noticed for 3 years. It is, in its own way, one of the loneliest things I've ever seen. I went to the memorial, I said. I don't know why I said it. She knew I went every year. But I kept going. I met Cameron there. She's a photographer. She covered the launch 3 years ago, and she had a photograph. She'd been carrying it for 3 years without knowing my name. Dr. Reeves was very still. She was crying, I said, at the memorial, for people she'd never met, because she felt like she owed them something. I stopped. Dr. Reeves looked at me for a long moment. And what did you feel? She said. I said, like someone had found something I didn't know I'd lost. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. Dr. Reeves picked up her coffee, looked into it, put it down. She does this when she's thinking. A small human gesture that I find oddly reassuring every time. The mission doesn't move, she said finally. You know that. I said, I know. She said, and you signed the papers. I said, I know. She said, so the question isn't whether you go. The question is what you do with the 6 weeks you have. I looked at her. She looked back. Don't waste them being careful, she said. You've been careful for 3 years. It hasn't made you happy. It's just made you punctual. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It came out before I could stop it, short and genuine. The kind that happens when something is both funny and unbearably true. Dr. Reeves allowed herself a small smile, which on her face is the equivalent of anyone else laughing until they cry. She stood up, which meant the meeting was over, which is also a Dr. Reeves thing. She ends conversations when they've reached their natural conclusion, and not a second later. I stood too. At the door she said, without turning around, Luna. I stopped. The first mission before the launch. You had a look on you. I waited. Like you'd already made peace with whatever was going to happen. I recognized those words. They were Cameron's words, describing Cameron's photograph, and hearing them from Dr. Reeves' mouth felt like two separate parts of my life, reaching across and touching without warning. "I don't want to see that look on you again," she said. "Not this time." I walked out into the Houston sun and stood in the courtyard for a while, not moving, letting that land exactly as hard as it needed to. Cameron texted me on a Friday evening with a message that said, "Are you doing anything tonight, or are you staring at your ceiling again?" I was, in fact, staring at my ceiling. I had been staring at it for approximately 40 minutes, which is long enough to start noticing the small crack near the light fixture that I've been meaning to report to my landlord for 8 months and have never reported because it feels like a commitment. I texted back, "Ceiling, obviously." She replied, "Come over. I have something to show you and bad wine, and I made pasta, which was ambitious of me." I was in my car in 4 minutes. I'm not going to pretend that was a difficult decision. Her apartment was the kind of place that told you everything about a person without them having to say a word. Books stacked horizontally on top of books, standing vertically because the shelves had given up. A print of a Vivian Maier photograph above the kitchen table, slightly crooked, that I suspected she'd stopped noticing years ago. Plants on every windowsill, real ones, alive, which told me she was more patient than she looked. Camera equipment on the kitchen counter next to a bowl of fruit. A corkboard above her desk covered in printed photographs, contact sheets, handwritten notes. A parking ticket from 2023 that I chose not to ask about. It was organized chaos, which is to say it was organized in a way that only made sense to her, which is to say it made complete sense to me immediately. The pasta was, objectively, very good. She seemed surprised by this. "I wasn't sure it was going to work," she said, which I found concerning as a statement about food that was already on the table and in my mouth. I told her it was excellent. She looked at her own bowl skeptically. "I think I got lucky," she said. I said, "Most good things involve some luck." She looked up at me. I looked back. We both returned to our pasta with great concentration, and absolutely nothing was said about any of that. After dinner, she brought out the hard drive. Not the professional portfolio. The real one. The private one she'd shown me in the cafeteria. But this time she'd been through it and pulled a specific folder, and when she opened it on her laptop and turned the screen toward me, I saw what it contained and stopped breathing for a moment in the way that you do when something is more than you expected. It was a folder labeled simply with my name, Luna. Inside were 47 photographs. Every photograph she'd taken of me since that Thursday morning in the training bay when I'd been standing at the window with my coffee, and she'd caught me without my knowing. 47 moments I hadn't been aware of. 47 versions of myself seen through her eyes. I looked through them slowly. I didn't say anything for a long time. There was one of me in the simulator, mid-problem, head bent over a panel, completely absorbed. One of me laughing at something off camera in the cafeteria, head thrown back, entirely unguarded. One from the parking lot evening, on the hood of my car, watching the Houston sky. I looked small against it, and also, somehow, completely at home. One from a morning she must have arrived early, of me standing outside the facility with coffee, face turned up to catch the first sun, eyes closed. In that one, I looked like the photograph from the memorial, and completely unlike it, at the same time. I looked like someone who had decided, without making a big announcement about it, to still be here. "Why are you showing me these?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Cameron was sitting beside me on the couch, close enough that I was aware of the warmth of her, not looking at the screen, but at me. "Because you should know what you look like," she said, "when you're not performing." I looked at her. "I don't perform," I said. She gave me a look that was so precisely calibrated between affection and skepticism that I felt it in my sternum. "Luna," she said. You perform constantly. You perform capable and fine and ready and okay. It's very convincing. I spent 3 weeks photographing the parts you forget to perform. I looked back at the screen, at the 47 versions of myself that she'd been quietly, carefully collecting. And what do those parts look like? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Like someone worth staying for, she said. The room was very still after that. Houston outside doing its usual Friday night things, distant traffic, someone's music 2 floors up, the particular hum of a city that never fully stops. Inside, something that had been building for 6 weeks arrived quietly at its conclusion, the way pressure systems do. Not with drama, but with the sudden, unmistakable sense of a change in the air. I closed the laptop gently. I turned to look at her. She was already looking at me, had been looking at me, with that careful and open expression that I had spent 6 weeks failing to find any defense against. I am not going to tell you I said something eloquent. I did not. What I said was, "This is inconvenient." Which is, I will acknowledge, a strange thing to say to someone who has just told you that you look like someone worth staying for. But Cameron understood immediately, because she is Cameron, and she said, "I know." And I said, "I leave in 2 weeks." And she said, "I know that too." And then neither of us said anything. Because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that hadn't been said didn't need words. I don't write about the kiss. Not because it didn't happen. It did. And it was the kind of moment that reorganizes something fundamental in your understanding of yourself. But because some things belong only to the people who were there. What I will say is that it was nothing like the launches I've been part of. Launches are loud and violent and full of controlled explosion. This was the opposite of that. This was the quietest thing I have ever been part of. This was 2 people who had found each other in a crowd of grief on a bench in Washington, D.C., and somehow ended up here, on a couch in Houston, choosing each other with full knowledge of the expiration date, and choosing each other anyway. We talked until 2 a.m., real talk. The kind that only happens when defenses are down and the hour is late enough that honesty becomes easier than performance. She told me about the photograph, about why she'd really kept it for 3 years. Not just because it was a good shot, because the woman in it had looked like she'd decided something, and Cameron had spent 3 years trying to figure out what it was, and had never quite been able to, and had carried the question around like a stone in her pocket. I told her what I'd decided, standing on that launch pad. I told her what it had cost. She listened without flinching, which is harder than it sounds. Most people flinch. At some point I looked up, and the crack in her ceiling was visible in the low light. Smaller than mine, different shape, same general energy of deferred maintenance. I pointed it out. She said she'd been meaning to report it for a year. I said, "It's not so bad." She looked at it. "No," she said, "it's not." She rested her head on my shoulder the way people do when they've made a decision they're not going to second guess. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the photograph still open in the folder on the closed laptop. I thought about launches, and about grief, and about 47 moments I hadn't known were being saved. Outside, Houston kept going. Inside, I stayed very still, because some moments deserve to be held carefully, and this was one of them. The launch date was a Tuesday. I know that sounds like an arbitrary detail, but it isn't. There's something about Tuesdays specifically that has always felt like the universe's least dramatic choice for significant events. Not a Monday, which would at least have the decency to feel like a beginning. Not a Friday, which would carry some weight. A Tuesday. I was scheduled to report to the facility at 500, complete final medical clearance by 0700, and begin pre-launch sequence at 0900. I had done this before. I knew every step. I had rehearsed it so many times that my body could execute it without input from the parts of my brain that were, currently, occupied with other things. The 2 weeks after Cameron's apartment were the most fully inhabited 2 weeks I'd had in 3 years. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I was present in them in a way I hadn't been present in anything since before the accident. Not performing readiness, not executing routine, not filling time between one obligation and the next. We went to a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, and she photographed vegetables for 20 minutes, while I ate a breakfast taco and pretended to be patient, which she saw through immediately. We drove to Galveston on a Sunday, because neither of us had a reason to, and that felt like reason enough. I taught her 3 things about orbital mechanics that she retained with suspicious accuracy, and she taught me that I had been making coffee wrong for my entire adult life, which I disputed and then tested, and then had to concede, which she was gracious about in the most insufferable possible way. I did not stop thinking about the mission. I want to be honest about that, because the alternative, pretending that love is large enough to make everything else disappear, is a kind of story I don't know how to tell and wouldn't want to. The mission was real. The crew was real. The work was important, in ways that existed independently of my personal life and always would. Dr. Reeves was right that I'd signed the papers, and I had signed them for real reasons, not just to flee Houston in the direction of outer space. Both things were true simultaneously, which is, I have found, how most important things work. Cameron never asked me to stay. I noticed this the way you notice an absence. Not because it left a gap, but because the space where pressure might have been was instead just open. She asked me once, the week before launch, what I was most afraid of. Not about the mission, just in general, currently, right now. I thought about it for a long time. I said, coming back to something that isn't there anymore. She looked at me steadily. And what are you most afraid of for me? I said. She considered it with the same seriousness. Waiting for someone who's already decided they left, she said. We looked at each other across that honesty. Neither of us looked away. The night before launch, I was in my apartment doing final personal checks. The small, mundane kind that no one films for documentaries. Watering my houseplant. Setting my email to out of office. Putting the photograph, my photograph, the printed one from the memorial with the white borders, carefully into the single personal item I was permitted to bring. I'd decided this weeks ago. It felt correct in the way that very few decisions feel correct, which is cleanly, without residue. I set my alarm for 400 and lay down and did not sleep, which was also correct, because sleeping felt like skipping something. At 0300 my phone lit up. Cameron. Not a text. A photograph. Taken that evening, from outside, through the window of a building I recognized immediately as the Johnson Space Center's main facility. Through the glass, lit from inside, was the mission briefing room. Empty now. Chairs pushed in. Screens dark. And reflected in the glass, ghosted over the image of the room, was Cameron's face. Her and the building at the same time, superimposed, occupying the same space. Underneath the photograph she'd written, I figured out what I want to do. I sat up in bed. I typed, tell me. 3 minutes passed. Then, tomorrow, at the facility. I'll be there. I arrived at 0450. She was already there, standing outside the main entrance in the early dark, camera bag over one shoulder, a coffee in each hand, one of which she held out to me without a word. I took it. It was the correct temperature, which meant she'd timed it, which meant she'd been planning this, which meant there was something happening that I didn't fully understand yet. I looked at her. She looked back. The Houston sky behind her was doing the pre-dawn thing where it's technically still night, but you can feel the day already pressing against it from underneath. You're here, I said. She said, I'm always here when something worth photographing is happening. What Cameron had done, what I learned standing outside the Johnson Space Center at 0450 on a Tuesday morning with a coffee that was exactly the right temperature, was this. She had spent the previous week quietly, methodically, and with complete characteristic thoroughness, applying for a position. Not with NASA, with the independent documentary team contracted to produce the official mission media package. The team responsible for tracking and telling the story of the mission from the ground. From Houston, from the communication center where she would have access to every transmission, every update, every frame of footage sent back from space. She had sent her portfolio on a Wednesday. They had called her on a Friday. She had accepted on a Saturday, and not told me until now. She wasn't following me into space. She was doing something more Cameron than that. She was finding the way to be part of the story without leaving the ground. She was staying, and making staying into something active, something chosen, something that looked through a lens and said, I see this. I'm documenting this. This matters. I stood there holding my coffee in the pre-dawn dark and looked at her and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years, which was the specific, almost unbearable sensation of having something real to come back to. Not an obligation, not a ghost. Something warm and present, and already holding a camera, and probably filing it under worth keeping. Dr. Reeves passed us on our way in, looked at Cameron, looked at me, looked at Cameron's camera bag, and said nothing. She did, however, nod. One small, decisive nod, the Dr. Reeves equivalent of a standing ovation. Then she went inside to oversee a launch. I looked at Cameron. She was already raising the camera. Don't smile, she said. Just look like yourself. I said, that's the same thing. She lowered the camera for half a second and looked at me directly, and her expression was the one from the bench, open and careful and completely real. Then the camera came back up. I looked at the sky the way I always do before a launch, not performing anything, not bracing for anything. Just looking. Somewhere above Houston, past the atmosphere, past everything I knew how to name, there was work to do, and a crew counting on me, and a universe that did not particularly care about my feelings. And somewhere behind a lens, there was a woman who would be here when I got back. I walked toward the facility. Cameron photographed every step. The sky went from dark to gold, the way it always does, the way it always will, completely indifferent to and completely perfect for the moment. And I went to do my job with the full, present, unhurried knowledge that this time, unlike the last time, I had every reason to come back. That's the whole story. 7 weeks, 1 photograph, and a woman who found a way to stay without going anywhere. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuinely. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments, was Cameron's decision what you expected? Because when I think about it now, it was the most her thing she could have possibly done. And I think I knew that before I even knew her name.